welcome to another episode of Two Old Psychologists Talking About Stuff. So, in keeping with the rest of this season, we've got another guest for you tonight. So, we have Dr. Duncan Gillard, who's going to talk to us about applications of acceptance and commitment therapy and contextual behavioural science to young people, with particular reference to his work in schools. But anyway, before that, we're going to catch up with Ray. So, how are you doing, my friend? What's been going on for you?
Oh, not so bad at all, thank you, Rich. What's been going on for me? I went back to the land of my childhood. Not just metaphorically in my mind. Physically. I went back to the northwest of England, just outside Bolton, where I grew up. And I had a little bit of time spare, so I thought I'll go for a walk. Somewhere I used to really like going for a walk as a kid. So on the side of the West Pennine Moors, which are magnificent but very sort of bleak, think kind of Wuthering Heights. In the early 1900s, an incredibly rich person, Lord Leverhulme, decided he would build himself this kind of almost like little fantasy land. So he had built this sort of this very posh bungalow, which is an odd word for such an amazing structure, and terraced gardens and waterfalls and Japanese gardens and stuff. And we used to go and play there when I was a kid because it was all in ruins, completely covered in rhododendrons. You could get lost in there, navigating for ages. All been tidied up now and beautiful paths. It all looks fantastic. And I had the experience that was weird in several ways. So it was a place that was very, very familiar to me from my childhood in some ways. But because it now wasn't as overgrown, there's whole bits of it I'd never been to before. So it was simultaneously very, very familiar and looked quite different, felt quite different to be around there. And sort of for the first time, I really noticed all these amazing structures and like bridges he built and stuff, just how much money that must have cost. Just unthinkable amounts of money for all of this to have been constructed at a time when, and in fairness, he probably wasn't the worst industrialist or the worst exploiter of people, but the vast majority of people working for him would have been pretty poor, would have been living on sort of very kind of basic existence. And the amount of money that had been poured into this was kind of suddenly made you think, I'm not enjoying this as much anymore. A bit like if you go and visit some beautiful stately home, which is absolutely wonderful until you think how much of this was paid for by slavery, and suddenly that same room doesn't look quite as sweet anymore. So I did have that slightly bittersweet experience of really enjoying being there and then suddenly thinking, oh, this ain't right.
The relational frame theorists have a word for that concept, don't they? We've probably talked about it before, but that's transformation of stimulus functions. The function, like the consequences of it, are transformed by a new bit of knowledge, and suddenly it doesn't feel the same. I've definitely had that same experience. I'm quite keen on history and wandering around, National Trust properties and old castles and things. And there is that bit of you that thinks, hang on, this guy's got a church in his back garden. Like, how on earth did he afford that? And there's sort of absolute orders of magnitude of wealth inequality that must have existed at that time for that to be the case. Something a little uncomfortable about that. There's a great song actually by there's a singer-songwriter that I like called Ian Prowse, and he was in a band called Amsterdam for a time, and they wrote a song. It was just like a love letter to Liverpool called "Does This Train Stop on Merseyside?" But there's a line in it: "See the slave ship sailing into port. The blood of Africa's on every wall." And it's just like all of those magnificent buildings as you walk around Liverpool. It's like pretty much all paid for by slavery.
Yeah.
Sobering.
And what about yourself?
Feel like this feels relevant for what we're going to talk about tonight, and I feel like I don't want to declare my hand too early because Duncan might have something to say about it, which would be far more informed. But I noted that recently the UK government has decided to go down the road of a total social media ban for under 16s, which I think I'm broadly in favour of because of what I would perceive as the numerous harms of social media to young people. And yeah, I'm interested. I'm interested in what people think about that. It's quite a big step to take. I think probably on balance a good thing. Interested to see what Duncan thinks, but I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah. I'm, as ever, kind of more ambivalent, as with most things,
You're going to
It's
fence to it
A,
again.
it's complicated, B, it depends, as my two default reactions to the world. You notice certain things, don't you? You notice certain things, like, yeah, the undoubted harms, the shifts it looks like in society and the exposure of young people to harms at a sensitive time of their development on that one hand. And on the other hand, um, the fact that things like social media can be a real boon to people who are kind of marginalized or lonely or discriminated against, can find a tribe that they can't access geographically. Um, Plus, I'm always really interested in how these things are going to work in practice. And I did sort of hear that when the attempt at having a social media ban in Australia has actually, there's still like 70 odd percent of young people are still managing to access all the same social media. They're just going about it in different routes. So it will be interesting to see A, if it ever happens, and B, to what extent. C, what an actually informed specialist in the lives of young people like Duncan might think
Mm.
about it.
I think my views on it are quite influenced by reading a book, The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, where he broadly sort of boils down the harms into 4 categories. And it felt quite compelling to me when I read it, although I'm aware it's had a bit of pushback, from
Right.
various corners. But the take-home message from the book was really, that the shift from a kind of play-based childhood to a phone-based childhood has really resulted in 4 things, which are social deprivation, so kids just hanging out with each other less than they did previously.
Mm.
Sleep deprivation, so kids up on screens or unable to sleep because they've been up on screens. Um, Attention problems, so the constant sort of drip, drip, drip of dopamine and the sort of frequent task switching that goes on social media. I
Mm.
mean, young people are finding it harder to focus their attention on any one thing for a longer period of time. Like becomes harder for them then to watch a film or read a book, for example.
Mm.
Just addiction. It's really hard for them to put it down.
Yeah.
All of those battles that parents have with kids kicking off when they are denied access to their drug of choice. I totally agree with what you're saying. Complicated. Practical implementation is hard. No doubt what you might solve with one hand, you might cause another problem elsewhere. Hi, Duncan.
Hi, Rich. Hi, Ray.
Hey, Duncan.
It's really great to have you here. We've got a whole bunch of questions for you. We can't wait to kind of interrogate you on your work. But first, if you wouldn't mind, I know we've sprung this on you, but we were just talking before you arrived about the social media ban, and we've laid the groundwork for our comments to be totally amateur and for the expert opinion on the subject to arrive right now.
Yeah, I think that my gut feeling is it'll be a good thing that we have this social media ban on many platforms for under 16s coming into force here in the UK. Obviously, Australia led the way on that. The data will tell the tale. I mean, we're pragmatists ultimately, I think, in our field, and we just want to see what the data tells us about the impact of that. As a parent, I notice every day, an intense pull for my kids toward screen time of some kind, mostly gaming, but also some social media platforms as well. It's so repetitive, and doom scrolling, kind of infinite doom scrolling, is really repetitive. And so um, part of me feels like it will be a good thing because it will, for many young people, help to kind of curb that. So there's something about it being, I think, again, the data will tell the tale, it being a good thing because it will somewhat limit certain kinds of access to screen time that's got a really appetitive pull to it. But I think the other side of the coin, and I think it is the same coin, it's just the other side of it, is the piece about if you're doing that, then what are you not doing? And we know that kids who get loads of exercise tend to be more mentally healthy. Kids that have really meaningful social connections tend to be more healthy psychologically. Kids who learn how to kind of navigate, cooperate, give, etc. within a social world tend to have improved well-being. And there are these patterns of behavior that I'm pointing to as I'm kind of talking here that are really important and well established across thousands of studies around predictors of mental health and well-being in youth populations that I think often don't have the opportunity to happen as much when social media and other forms of screen time have such a pull, such a strong and unregulated pull on young people's time.
Yeah, I think there's a few things yet to be revealed, aren't there? Like the precise details of it. Ray was talking about that. The implementation is quite a different thing from the intention. And like, for example, Roblox, for example, as a gaming platform, is that included or not included? It's all of those kinds of things. Yeah. What about in schools? What's your professional view of the difference it might make to the social environment in school?
Well, schools here in the UK, at least, have quite significant variation right now with respect to their policies and practices on having smartphones, smart devices in school. I guess what the regulation will do is create a more even playing field with respect to certain aspects of school practices. Not all of them, but certain aspects of school practices. Increasingly, what I'm noticing and we're talking about mainly secondary schools here, I think, increasingly what I'm noticing in secondary schools, which for those folk listening in who are not UK based, for us, that's kind of 11, 12-year-olds and up, is schools have phone lockers at the beginning, at the entrance to the building. So when young people come in, they put their phone in a locker, they therefore have a delegated number, and they pick their phone up on the way out. I think that's a pretty decent system. I like that idea. I like the idea actually as a parent of kids in a city. And I don't think it's exclusively in a city, but that's my experience. So I notice it as kind of being related to living in a city. I like the idea of my kids having their phones to get to and from school because I can track them and know where they are. It's probably my favorite feature of smartphones for kids, actually. It allays my anxiety because I kind of can see that they're safe because they're moving up the right road at the right time of the day because they're heading to school or heading home. And so I like the idea that kids can bring their smartphones into school, secondary phase, and bring them home from school, but not have them in school. And a bit like I was saying before, I suppose, by not having them in school and having smart devices, including gaming, pulling on your time in school, there's more room for all the other stuff, right? All the stuff that we know is really good for children's mental and physical health and well-being.
All the things that made us the rounded adults that we are.
Well, you maybe.
I mean, thank you, Duncan. It's fascinating to hear both that professional perspective and the personal one as a parent. My kids are both in their 30s, so we didn't really hit this nearly so much. Just beginning to come in a little bit, but nothing like folks have these days. And having kind of rolled straight into that topic, what we've not done is introduced you properly. So Duncan, in fact, let me get you to introduce yourself so that our listeners can hear a little bit more about you.
So I'm Duncan Gillard. I'm a psychologist. I'm an educational psychologist by training. I finished my doctoral studies back in 2011. So I'm 15 years, I guess, postdoc practice now. The way I tell the story very often, and of course, the way you kind of tell it depends upon the context, is that my passion could be described and the way that my practice therefore has increasingly pivoted over the years could be described is as the interface between evidence-based mental health and well-being practice and education. And those two strands don't always go well alongside one another. There's ever such a lot at all three tiers, kind of universal, targeted, and specialist that happens within education settings, within the education sector more generally. And yet, I think here in the UK and in other countries, some are a bit further ahead than us, some maybe not quite so far ahead, we're on a journey when it comes to implementing evidence-based, evidence-informed, evidence-consistent practice in education. And so, a real mission and push for my colleagues and I over the years has been to increase the presence of practice that can be well linked to evidence with children, young people, families and schools, because we work a lot in the home as well. I guess I like to think of myself as a kind of researcher practitioner, but a researcher practitioner that has sort of 8 toes in the practitioner world and 2 toes in the research world. And that's always felt like a kind of pretty healthy way to go about doing applied psychology. I love that idea of a reticulating model that contextual behavioural science brings, where there's a strong kind of ever-flowing network-like relationship between those doing the research, including basic and applied research, and those like myself who've kind of got 8 toes in the practice game. But what that means for me in practice is that we collect a lot of data in relation to our intervention work at individual level, which we often then aggregate at group level, and sometimes for kind of universal populations, including a curriculum that we develop called Connect, and seek to write that up and publish it and contribute to the literature, not just draw from the literature. Written a couple of books and bits and bobs like that, but that's probably enough for now.
That's more than enough for anyone. The other question we always ask people is, given that the theme of this podcast in many ways is this approach to psychological well-being called acceptance and commitment therapy or contextual behavioural science. One thing we tend to ask everybody is, how did you get into that then? Many other flavours of psychology are available.
Yeah.
What got you into ACT?
How far back do we want to go? I think we can probably all tell a tale that takes us maybe as far back as childhood if we keep tracing the kind of antecedent behaviour, consequence, right the way back to when we were really young. I guess maybe my story starts in my teens, where I didn't particularly get on with school life and didn't find my way through school, I suppose. Didn't find the thing I wanted to do through school. And definitely recall spending a couple of years after school kind of just kicking around really and just trying to establish a sense of identity and who I was and what I wanted to do and who I wanted to be in the world, trying to find a way of belonging and those kinds of things. And then I stumbled upon mindfulness and yoga and grew up in Devon, where there's not a lot going on in terms of career opportunities. And there was a small contingent of people in Devon about my age, maybe a bit older, who were like off traveling to India. And it kind of seemed like a really exciting thing to do. So I discovered mindfulness, I discovered yoga, started practicing those a little bit. And that, nutshell took me off traveling to India to learn more and more about yoga. And so I became really passionate about and interested in actively pursuing knowledge and practice experience in kind of Eastern arts, I suppose, yoga, mindfulness, Buddhism, Zen, and other traditions. And I had a place reserved for an undergraduate in psychology before I went, which I'd planned to defer for a year. And then I came back 4 years later. So I deferred it for 4 years. And for some reason, they decided to hold the place for me. So I came back and finally did this undergraduate degree in psychology. And fortunately, even though there was a lot about that degree that was not easily linked for me to spiritual practices, the kinds of practices I've just been referencing, there were modules, particularly up through into kind of year 3, that started to point in that direction. There was a module on consciousness studies. There was which had talked a lot about self and contemplative practices and the relationship between free will determinism and so on and so forth. And mindfulness started to seep into that. And philosophy of mind literature was kind of relevant. And all of that really piqued my interest. That sort of set the scene for me being, really interested in mindfulness practices. And then I, in a sense, kind of happened upon a job as an assistant psychologist in a service delivering PBS services, which are very much informed by the principles of behavioural science. For those of you that don't know, positive behaviour support services, working with young people presenting with behaviour that challenges, and in our case, some significant learning needs. And it was through being in that role and applying behavioural science in that context that I encountered relational frame theory. And so, which is, of course, you guys know very, very well, is the theoretical underpinning, the theory of human language, cognition, and emotion that underpins acceptance and commitment therapy. So we started applying RFT to see if we could support the emergence of generalized relational responding in young people with very, very low levels of kind of language and communication skills, with some success. So I kind of came at relational frame theory before I came at acceptance and commitment therapy, but very, very soon after that, encountered relational frame theory, read the 99 book, could see how connected it was to, and how much it had been informed by Eastern and spiritual traditions, and in a sense borrowed from those traditions, including mindfulness. So there was an easy in for me there. There was a sense of relatability to ACT, more so than other therapeutic models, because of it having drawn in some spiritual practices, what one might characterize as spiritual practices, including mindfulness. That was my journey in, really.
Thanks, Duncan. It's fascinating to have these chats with people and find all of their different kind of routes in. So, I mean, I think I know you, and I guess most people would know you for your work with younger people. So bearing in mind that the audience we tend to have for this podcast is a mix of sort of therapists and people in and around the psychology world, as well as regular folk who haven't gone down that road in their career. What would you say would be the differences of trying to do acceptance and commitment therapy work with younger people
as compared to adults?
Yeah.
Well, maybe at least one obvious thing to say is that younger people haven't been on the planet as long as older people have, as long as adults have. And so the history that they have to track the workability in the longer term of the ways that they're engaging in the world, the ways that they're acting is shorter. And that's a developmental consideration that always needs to be built in where CBS, contextual behavioural science informed interventions, are concerned. In actual fact, interestingly, with younger children, we don't tend to find in our intervention work that going too heavy on the direct interaction with children is all that effective, if I'm honest. What we tend to find is much more effective is working through parents and carers and significant others who are supporting at school sometimes as well. It's much more powerful, generally speaking, for kind of in a way obvious and pragmatic reasons, which is those people are a part of the context of the children we're working with to a far greater degree than we could ever be. And we don't have the capacity to be in there working, 3-4 hours a day or even more, 5, maybe even 6, 7 days a week. I mean, what psychologist has the capacity to do that kind of intense? Who would want it, frankly? But what kind of psychologist would have the capacity to do that kind of work? And yet parents are in that position. And so in our work work as part of Enable Trust, which I can perhaps tell you a bit more about in due course, there's a lot of focus when we're working with young people, children in particular. I'm talking about kind of maybe pre-13, pre-12, certainly pre-11. There's a much stronger focus on working with and through parents in an ACT, an acceptance and commitment therapy consistent way, than there is on working directly with young people. And part of the reason for that is that parents, carers have an enormous amount of influence. They may not be using it always, and if they are, they may not be using it always in the most helpful and workable ways long term, but potentially, or in actuality, they have an enormous amount of influence to be able to help create a context for their child to thrive, right? And so so working through them and changing the way that they're showing up as parents, changing the way that they're relating to and responding to their own internal content, their thoughts, their feelings, their sensations, is kind of by derivation profoundly impactful for the children that we work with very often. And I go so far as to say that in our work in Enable Trust over the last coming on 4 years now, our most, by some margin, effective work with younger children has been through parents. and schools, but particularly parents.
So, like, I feel like I want to take my hat off to you, in the sense that, not just you, but like everyone who does this kind of work. Because I always found, like, when I was doing my doctoral studies and I had different placements in different, parts of the NHS, I always found those parts of the NHS where I had to work through somebody else rather than have the kind of end user in front of me, I
Mm,
found that much more challenging. And so I think
yeah,
that's probably why I ended up working with adults, because maybe it's just me and my particular sort of strengths, but I found it difficult. I found it really challenging to work
yeah,
via some other kind of system.
totally. And in a sense, what you've said cues me back to something I said earlier, this piece about how younger people, especially children, sort of pre-11s, but adolescents as well, haven't been on the planet long enough very often to have tracked the long-term unworkability of some of the ways that they're engaging in the world. And so actually working through parents for that reason is very helpful too, because they've come to us because they can see what's happening as unworkable. They just may not be able to find what was workable without some support. But also, what you've said, I think, is important with respect to understanding what might motivate a young person to be willing to engage with us or not. Lots of young people that we work with, when we first start working with them, their level of motivation to engage with us is not that high. In fact, actually, if we only ever worked with the young people who explicitly gave us written consent to work with them at the beginning of our work, we'd get to work with less than half the young people we've actually been useful for. And so we have to be a little bit creative in the way that we kind of, in an organic and kind of long, over time, seek consent to continue the work. We almost have to kind of get them to buy into us over time. And that takes a while, because for many young people that come to us, we're just another adult to get out of the way so that they can engage in fun, risky social stuff.
You've talked to us, Duncan, about particularly the younger people and the working with the younger children. What might you say that was at all different as we're moving into that secondary school phase and heading through adolescence more? Does the picture change, or is it fundamentally the same?
It changes in our experience. And every young person, you do your own functional contextual formulation. And so that means not just doing, in our experience, that means not just doing an assessment of the young person, but an assessment of the young person in context. And family is important and school is important, context. And as a general rule, hold all rules lightly, as a general rule, working with adolescents is different, especially as a general rule, when you hit kind of 14, 15, 16. At least a couple of things happen kind of psychosocially, I think. One is parental influence, quite naturally, quite importantly, in many ways healthily, diminishes over time. Like, that's just what's meant to happen, right? Like, that's okay. It's meant to be that way. And so we have to respect that, like often at that stage of development, trying to be a force for positive influence, a force for good in a young person's life when a young person's reached that stage by working through parents. Not always, but very often it's a bit benign, doesn't really work. You can't shift things so much. And then the focus becomes more on working directly with the young person. So that's one thing that changes, this idea that parental influence diminishes over time. And the other thing, which is kind of building on what we've said already, is increasingly the young people at that age get up to 16, 17, 18 and beyond. We work with young people into their 20s, in theory, and occasionally, not too often, but occasionally in practice. They've been on the planet for a bit longer. They're starting to get a sense of maybe what they want their life to be about, and/or what might be missing from their life, and/or the workability or unworkability of what's going on for them right now. And so what happens then is often there's a shift in motivation toward, I need some help, So then we've got the motivative augmentals in place to be able to start working with them directly and seeing meaningful behavior change start to establish.
I'm going to have to ask you to backtrack there, Duncan. See, I can't even say it. Motivative augmentals?
Yeah, sorry, I'm being geeky. So, values are a good example of motivative augmentals, right? So, increasingly, we find through the developmental stages and through adolescence into the older stages of adolescence, it's easier for us to get really meaningfully in contact with what a young person thinks they care about, whether it's intimacy, whether it's social contact and relationships, whether it's a sense of, I don't know where my life's going and that scares me and I want to figure out where my life's going. Um, uh, those provide the conditions for us to help a young person increasingly get in touch with what's missing, what's present that they want more of, which basically is kind of a values formulation with the young person live and on the fly. Those values are they're verbal, things we talk about, and they can be augmentals for behavior change, meaning they can increase if we talk about them and start to think about what they might look like for a young person. They can increase, if you do the work well, a young person's motivation to engage in a different way of living.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I'm guessing that there's a number of areas where the kinds of concepts that we've probably talked a lot about over the episodes of this podcast might need, rewording. Like, I'm thinking about values, for example. You could probably have a conversation about values with, a significant number of adults, and they have a sense of what you're talking about. I imagine, not working with younger people myself, that's a less straightforward conversation with an adolescent or a younger person. Are there various conceptual things about ACT that have to be different?
We're not so much these days driven in our practice by a kind of hexaflex formulation so much as a DNAV informed formulation. And the DNAV model was developed by two wonderful colleagues over in Australia, Louise Hayes and Joe Cherokee. And it built in developmental considerations in a way that I don't think was ever no criticism of the hexaflex or of, conceptualizations of psychological flexibility that came before it, but were never really built with developmental considerations in mind. And in actual fact, there's a reasonable amount of evidence supporting the use of hexaflex or kind of like more traditional ACT-informed processes with young people pre-DNAV. But I think right now we have a model originally written into book form in 2015 that is developing an increasing evidence base around its application with young people. And so we tend toward that model. And so maybe circling back more specifically to your question, Rich, like rather than talking about contact with the present moment, we use the term noticer, developing our noticer skills. That's what N stands for in DNAV. That's got lots of parts to it. Like all middle level terms, there's a kind of fuzziness to that, and you can peer inside it and see greater specificity. I would say inside that there is part of the noticer that sometimes we're working on, which is just about becoming aware of what's happening right now. There's a part of what we target when we talk about noticer skills in DNAV that's about learning to name or to tact your internal experience on a moment-to-moment basis, like what's going on for you right now. Can you name that? There's a part of this noticer process that we target that is more about like what the kind of proper behavioural science folk or the kind of, traditional behavioural science folk would refer to as intraverbals, like the ability to kind of have a conversation that is kind of effectively behavioural, is verbal behaviour in response to other verbal behaviour, right? Like where we talk about what's happening in our internal worlds. That's not just labeling, I feel anxious. That's a meaningful kind of like two-way exchange, right? So becoming aware of it, naming it, describing it in a conversation. And I think the piece that sometimes people don't see quite so obviously inside DNAV, but it is probably more obviously inside the hexaflex, probably fair to say, I noticed that anyway, is the flexible responding to emotion as well. So yes, becoming aware of it. Yes, learning to name it. Yes, learning to talk about it fluently and coherently in a conversation. And also being able to sit with it, being able to let the discomfort be there when doing so is useful. So I guess I've kind of gone a little bit into a specific process within the DNAV model. And of course, that's just one of several, 6, in fact, processes within the DNAV model. But I'm just pointing to, we have a slightly different way of thinking about and conceptualizing and building interventions when we're doing psychological flexibility work with young people. And the DNAV model tends to be our guiding framework for that.
I guess even if we don't have time to cover all of those processes within it, I guess folks are going to be intrigued. We've heard what the N was for.
What's the other
Did you
stuff?
hear about the D and the A and the V?
So DNA, discoverer, trying out new things, and tracking how they work for you. Does this make my life better? Does this make my life worse? That's the D. The N we've talked about. A, the advisor. It's a metaphor for our ongoing kind of internalizing, our ongoing kind of minding process. The way I like to think about the advisor is it's not just thoughts, it's thoughts that guide action or inaction. So when our mind says, do this, do that, or do less of this, or don't do that, that's our advisor on the fly. It's advisor guiding how we act or don't. It's thoughts, rather, guiding how we act or don't act. So that's D, N, A. In many ways, actually, and I've done this in trainings in recent times, actually, discover a noticer and advisor, you could, if you wanted to just kind of sum it up super simply, is go discover a behavioural flexibility and behavioural variation, noticer, emotional flexibility, advisor, cognitive flexibility. And then you've got the V, which is values, not entirely dissimilar to the hexaflex. The values are on the hexaflex as well. And the way that we tend to work with adult populations, including parents, there's more of a kind of iterative vibe in my experience to doing values work with young people. Like, rather than going like, clarify your values, do what you care about. My experience is it's not quite so top down. And part of the reason for that is I notice a strong sense very often, and this is across developmental trajectory from children right the way through to adolescents. There's a really rich sense when you're doing good values work with a young person that you're creating a way of talking about values, rather than, in a sense, discovering values that might almost feel like they're already there. We just haven't talked about them in quite the right way yet, such that we could bring them to bear on places where we're struggling or suffering. And there's a sense of how when you're doing values work and a young person's really engaged, there's a sort of sense of like light bulb moments and like, wow, I hadn't really thought about it like that before. Like I was doing an assessment for a wonderful young girl just, I think it was yesterday or day before yesterday. It was very recently this week. And obviously I won't name anything that could compromise her identity. But this particular girl was a young person in care. And this particular young person really wants to work in the caring professions. Not quite sure where she wants to go just yet. We talked about a couple of different professions that you might generally frame within the caring, helping professions. But within that, she was very reflective, actually. I was very impressed with her noticer skills, actually. She was able to be open to my suggestion that maybe the reason this is so important to you, maybe the reason this is something you care about so much is because you've had your own significant struggles in life that led to you going into care. And she was all over that. Not in a, yeah, that's it kind of way, but in a kind of, whoa, yeah, that's why kind of way, There's a process of creating a sense of like, where there's pain, there can be purpose if you can do that. And so where there's discomfort, there's also what you care about. Or if we want to flip it and talk it in this way, there's values.
Just thinking if there's parents listening to this who might be, interested in trying to apply some of these ideas, I find that quite appealing, that idea of selling ACT as like a bunch of skills, right? And so you've grouped them there, or the model has grouped them there into like discoverer, noticer, advisor skills, and then there's some sort of skill in terms of value, like clarifying your values and what matters to you. I always think of working with kids as being a really tough gig, right? And like, how do you sell these complex ideas, or even the idea of working with a psychologist? Like, what kid's going to want to do that, right? You've got to find some sort of language. So I'm just thinking about if parents are listening, is am I on the right track there, that you're just trying to think about these as useful skills to develop that kind of just maybe make the world a bit more easy to navigate?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, interestingly enough, actually, what really shows up for me when I hear you ask that question, even though you've sort of, I guess, invited me to respond referencing parents, is schools actually. Schools are such a massive part of young people's life context, and if you ever get a chance to read the Children's Society's annual Good Childhood reports, you know, it's, as far as I'm aware, it's the main annual report in the United Kingdom with respect to the state of the nation, the young people within the nation's mental health, right? Like an important document that's published annually. The last 3 times I've read it, schools and young people's experience of schools has been one of the most significant contributors to young people's reports of poor mental health, like significant stressors, keeps them awake at night. They worry about people's other students' impressions of them. Appearance is really big, and so on. Right. So schools can be a significant source of stress and distress. And of course, there's a sense in which, if you buy into this kind of eudaimonic way of thinking about well-being, which I think is what ACT is a part of, that being able to cope with the challenges that life throws at you is important. Well-being isn't all about feeling good, it's about living well. And yet I think we need to recognize that as maybe being sometimes something else. It's not just about training resilience. It's about, quality of life. And how do we make schools something that, as much as possible in the present moment, and certainly in the long term, something that improves young people's quality of life. So coming back to your point about skills, schools love not just DNAV, but this psychological flexibility way of thinking about well-being, because it's skills-based. It provides an alternative narrative to the way I think about it anyway. It provides an alternative narrative to the mental health narrative of psychological well-being. It offers a skills-based narrative to well-being. Of course, what's school's about? Developing skills. Oh, great, cool. This is what we do. We're on the same page. Winner. In that sense, it's quite an easy sell. We're going to develop skills for living well, skills for resilience, skills for well-being. It's just skills, psychological and behavioural skills. Or you can call it one, you can call it the other, you can call it both. And that tends to go down well as a narrative. It's like, we talk, don't we, in relational frame theory about coherence. That is a coherent narrative, a coherent way of thinking about things for schools. They think about things in terms of skills. When we talk about psychological resilience and well-being skills, it's like, cool, that's what we're developing here. So my experience in schools love that. And so, we talk about developing discoverer skills, noticer skills, advisor skills, value skills, flexible purpose, I think, is another way of thinking about value skills. Because, values change in context, right? If you ask me about my story, what I care about as a parent, I'll tell you a story and it will really matter. If you ask me about what I care about as a professional, I'll tell you a very different story and it's equally as true and it will matter just as much. Flexible purpose. I kind of increasingly like that phrase with respect to values. And I noticed that I might be going off on the beaten track. And so maybe you might want to bring me back.
That was some excellent noticing. Well done, Duncan.
Thank you.
You've started to tell us a little there, or at least implied, about sort of larger scale engagement with organisations, schools particularly. And I know that in addition to the individual work, such as you gave us an example of, which I could see because we have a little video channel running when we record this, and so I could actually see, or it appeared to me, that you were quite sort of moved in recalling that. So obviously that has importance to you. But maybe you could tell us a little bit about some of the projects you've been involved in recently that have engaged at that bigger scale.
So around about 4 years ago, we managed to secure a pretty decent amount of funding from NHS England to set up a team called Enable Inclusion Team, which is now part of a wonderful, really wonderful multi-academy trust of schools called Enable Trust. So the post I currently hold is Principal Psychologist for Enable Trust. That's my main job, my 3-day-a-week job. the project initially was set up to support young people at risk of school exclusion. And it's also now kind of merged or diversified, grown to also focus on supporting young people who are anxious about and therefore avoid going into schools. So we work kind of quite intensively with both those, broadly speaking, both those populations of young people. We've got a number of publications out around that now with some really great outcome data in relation to increased attendance, improved wellbeing, improved psychological flexibility, reductions for young people at risk of school exclusion, reductions in their risk of school exclusion, reductions in the number of suspensions as a result of behaviour that school felt they were unable to keep safe. And so we've got some lovely outcome data as a result of that. That project we're seeking to, so it's now in the national guidance here in the UK for best practice, supporting young people in both those spaces, young people anxious about school and young people at risk of school exclusion. Guidance was published less than a year ago. So that's really excellent, gives us a little bit of national profile and something we can reference when we're trying to kind of grow this work. Our aim really is to build more and more of those kinds of projects by working in partnership with other local areas, supporting them through training and supervision to get similar such projects up and off the ground. And then our hope is we can have enough exemplars of this kind of across the country to be able to start to lobby the government, central government, for a more coordinated national programme based on this work. That's the end goal on that. But there's a couple of really neat projects that have kind of emerged out of that. And one that I think might be really useful to talk about is a pilot project we're about to get underway called PIES, which is an acronym for Psychologically Informed Environments in Schools. The Department for Education, the regional team here in the southwest of England, have been kind of watching with interest what we've been doing the last few years. And we've had like very positive interactions and some support from the regional director here in the southwest, the regional director for the DFE, I should say, here in the southwest, and her team. And so now what we have is some funding under something called the RIA grant, which is an acronym for Regional Improvements and Innovations Alliance, under the RIA grant, to pilot specialist inclusion bases in mainstream schools, mainstream secondary schools, based on psychological flexibility, based on the DNAV model. So we've got 10 schools that we're just lining up the training for, and we're about to get started with from September. So 1 year pilot, carefully monitored in terms of outcome data, from educational data through to school belongingness data, attainment data, and more general kind of mental health and wellbeing outcomes. And what we're told is, because to be frank, this is an under-researched area, this recent government white paper here in the UK is all about evidence-based practice in schools, in narrative at least. And it's also strongly advocating for inclusion bases. And yeah, interestingly, there's not a lot of evidence for inclusion bases in schools. So, what do you do when you're in that space where there are two narratives that don't sit well together in a kind of government white paper? Well, you try to build your practices based on evidence-informed principles, which of course includes ACT. And so what we're just about to embark on, we're doing the first training day next week, is supporting staff and senior leaders in resource bases, so inclusion bases, mainstream secondary schools, to practice in a way that's consistent with the DNAV model. So that's really exciting. And I do think that's a ticket to national and even kind of global influence, really, for psychological flexibility models. If we can demonstrate efficacy with this pilot, we're being told that there would be given the thin research base in this particular space, there would be an appetite from the DFE to support regional and potentially national upscaling of the project. So that's kind of cool.
That's very exciting.
Can I ask, just off the back of that, one thing or two things? So I read your article that you recently had published in the Psychologist, and we can put a link to that in the show notes because I think it's really worth people reading. I was really shocked at the extent of the problem. So there's a bit, you've got in that first paragraph there that it's like persistent absence, which you define as missing 10% or more of school sessions. That was 21% of pupils in 2022-23. And the question I wanted to ask you was, let's say I'm one of those kids and I find myself in one of these inclusion units that's being run according to the DNAV model. What is my experience like? What's happening to me that you would be measuring?
The PIES project is not our first rodeo into supporting school-based practitioners to use psychological flexibility models. Traditionally, how we've done that, I say traditionally, over recent years, how we've done that is to provide training and group-based supervision and sometimes one-to-one supervision for practitioners doing a lot of the work, not unusual modes of, supporting the development of skill sets across any sector, particularly training, supervision, coaching, etc. And it's interesting, right? Like, I love the narrative that flows through the lifeblood of behavioural science that skills are more important than qualifications. Like, sure, qualifications can offer certain safeguards, but people in schools, pastoral teams in schools, they're not qualified therapists, but there's reasonable evidence. Trish Arnold's published a systematic review of this, I want to say about 4 years ago in JCBS, Journal of Contextual Behavioural Science, effectively an evidence review of, or a systematic review, one or the other, of the research around the feasibility of non-mental health practitioners effectively using acceptance and commitment therapy and allied models. And, the findings were pretty encouraging. There's a fair amount of studies out there showing that this is possible. We've got studies published as well, including one in the Connect curriculum with over 700 children being supported by class teachers with less than a day's worth of training in DNAV, with statistically significant shifts from pre to post 18 lesson plans, 1 hour a week for 18 weeks, statistically significant improvements on self-reported wellbeing measures using something called the MAMF, the Me and My Feelings questionnaire. It's difficult to get really decent standardized self-reports for children kind of 7 to 11, but that one was about the best we could find. And teacher-reported SDQs, like both of those measures shifted from pre to post. So coming back to your question, or at least I think I'm going to try to come back to your question. People who are not qualified therapists, including school-based folk, if they've got an appetite to do this, they can develop these skills. Their qualifications matter much less. They need the training, sure. They need the supervision because that functionally helps shape their practice. Absolutely.
So if I'm a kid, though, would I notice, like, hey, what's Miss on? She started talking strange. Would I notice that she's been on this training, or is it just sort of subtle tweaks to the way
Yeah.
the regular stuff is delivered?
Yeah.
Where the teachers are then embedding the skills that they've learned on your training.
So one of the first, I am going to come to your question, but one of the first big DNAV implementation projects that I was involved in was called Reboot West, working with young care leavers. And they developed a brand and they have products that they sell and the proceeds go back into the charity, right? Called Better Conversations with DNAV. Love that phrase. Demystifies therapy beautifully. We're just finding ways of having really skillful interactions with young people. That's what this is. We're teaching people to use DNAV almost like on the fly as a coaching model that they can kind of have in the back of their head to help guide them in the way that they have conversations with young people. We don't have to sit in a therapy room necessarily. We can do. We don't have to sit in a therapy room and have these conversations. We can be kicking a ball around. We can be going for a walk around the school. We can be sitting in the pastoral room having a cup of tea or a glass of water or something. The magic here is like bringing evidence-based processes of psychological care into the lives of young people in the moment where they're at, which is at schools and which is in their homes and which is in their community. So that's why, in enabling inclusion team more generally, we use these principles of like, we're all about community-based working, bringing the psychology to where the young people are at. And it just so happens that schools is where they're at. And so maybe at a more granular level, trying to respond to your question, Rich, like, what does it look like? Well, when a young person comes into school and there's significant maybe issues going on with respect to caregiving at home, and maybe they have they're a child in need or on a child protection plan or something like that. and they come into stress because yet again, it's been a bit of a shit show. Can I say that? Kind of like on this podcast, like at home, things are really, really tough. And they come in and they're not ready to go into their maths lesson. How it looks in the moment is you have a practitioner who knows how to have a really skillful conversation with you to target psychological flexibility processes live on the fly in the moment, to go like, that sounds super hard. Let's take a moment together. We're okay. I've got you. We've got this. What's the most important thing to you right now? Let's think about that. And to slow it down, getting in touch with the present moment, right? What you're expecting, to name things, like, because, we're talking about the noticer, right? Like becoming aware, naming and describing intraverbally in a conversation. So young people, learning often happens through scaffolding, right? Prompts that kind of cue these behavioral skills and then they get reinforced, right? And to see the behavior consequence. In many ways, a conversation is just an ongoing sequence of ABCs. And we're trying to be a skillful A and a skillful C so that the right behaviors shape up in the face of difficult emotions or difficult experiences more generally. But they're not necessarily things that people are trained to do without the kind of stuff that, folk like us try to do.
I guess as opposed to screaming at the kid, get in that lesson or I'll take you to the headmaster's office, which is pretty much my experience when I was a child at school. Don't get me wrong, because of good teachers, but I think the dealing with behaviour that kind of challenged the system probably wasn't dealt with very skillfully back then.
Yeah.
This sounds like a pretty significant upgrade. I like the idea, and because I found myself doing bits of this work, sometimes if I've been invited to do training with, let's say, physiotherapists or support workers, like my job isn't to create an army of ACT therapists. It's just to try and embed some skills to help people do the job that they already do in a slightly more psychologically informed way. I'm guessing, Ray, you've done a bunch of that kind of stuff in your work too.
It was so funny hearing you talk, Duncan, because you talk about people kind of right at the beginnings of their lives. Much of my work's been in hospitals and hospices and in immediate sort of post-bereavement care, and exactly the same things. The people who are often given the most skilled as well as the most direct support are not therapists, not psychotherapists in any sense. They are the nurses, the doctors, a whole range of people. And as with yourself, Duncan, a lot of my time in training is, much as I love teaching sort of ninja therapy to people with loads of years of psychotherapy training, some of the best stuff, and I think probably, if you could weigh it, the most impactful, is that slightly different way of having a difficult conversation. Takes you to a different place in exactly the way you're talking about, which can be done with relatively low input. Given we accept, and I'm sure it's true of your guys as well, you're actually training into a very high background level of interpersonal skill and psychological mindedness in a general sense.
So we want to engage you in a little bit of role play, Duncan. So picture this, Ray and I, we've staged a coup. We've taken over the country. We've installed you, obviously. Our first thought was to install you as the Minister for Education with control over policy. You sat at your desk on the first day. What are you going to do? Day one, what's your first directive? What are you going to change?
Do you know what, Ray? I remember mentioning that this was going to happen to me on this podcast, and I was like, okay, I better do some thinking about that then. And of course, how much thinking have I done? None. But I can tell you the first thing that comes to mind, and I suppose it relates to what, by one characterization, is what I and my colleagues, I think, have been trying to do for the last couple of decades, and that is, I would love to see evidence-based practice around mental health and well-being, and kind of by extension, a really strong, meaningful investment in the whole young person be culturally embedded in our education systems. I can't tell you how many times when I've been involved in papers or even bids for funding where we've referenced approaches, programs, curriculums even, and targeted systems that are being used to support children and young people in educational systems that have not even a moderate, but no credible evidence base whatsoever. And I'm like, why? What's happening here? Like, what are the selection criteria that lead to that getting selected and something else which might have a much better evidence base not getting selected? What's happening? Like, it's a cultural ill, as far as I'm concerned. That sounds maybe a bit brutish, maybe a bit strong, but I'm okay with that. Like, it's wrong. It's a cultural ill, and I think most people don't see it on the fly. I'd love to see that change. Like schools, I have to say, I think schools are some of the best examples of outcomes-based cultures. Now, that's not the same as saying I agree with the kind of outcomes they have to work toward. That's different. But outcomes is absolutely running through the lifeblood of our education system. It totally is. They're absolutely held to account to outcomes with respect to education by the DfE, by Ofsted, and by local authorities too, to an extent. But not when it comes to mental health and well-being. And I would like to see that happen much, much more. And schools just become really discerning with respect to the practices that they select that really do promote the well-being and just general life prospering of their kids. Like, sorry, I'll stop in a minute, I will, but stop spending money from the public purse on things that don't work, that it's pointless. It's worse than pointless because now you're less well off than you were before and the kids are no better off. Let's change that, please. Oh, there you go. That's my rant. You invited it.
I really wish the listeners could have seen that. We picked the right guy for the job for Minister of Education, do you think, Ray?
Clearly, I'd vote for him. Being an evidence-driven guy, Duncan, you as you say, you pay great attention to outcomes and to try and do stuff that's worth doing and has an impact. So that's going to be like within every project, does this work? What's the evidence? If we kind of zoom out a little bit and just say more generally, what have you learned? I mean, what do you feel you've learned about the world, about people, about humanity from this remarkable set of work you've been involved with so far?
Wow, that's a massive question. I'll have a go. And feel free to steer me a little bit if you think I'm going a little bit off-piste.
There is no piste. This is a piste-free zone.
Okay. Proper freestyling. I love it. When we started developing the Connect curriculum, which is effectively a 260 lesson plan psychological flexibility curriculum for children aged 4 to 11 years of age, we saw a lot of programs being used, and this circles back to my earlier point actually, that had no evidence base. And of course that kind of frustrated us. We wanted to see a different world for in this particular space. And going back to that point about, what are the selection criteria that get those systems selected over other systems? A lot of it's about social acceptability, by which I mean, do the schools feel they can do this, like deliver this curriculum, deliver this program or whatever? Is this doable for them in their context? Maybe you could even extend that further and say, do schools enjoy doing it? And do schools believe in it? The teachers enjoy delivering it. Do they believe in it? I think you could say that that's also part of the whole kind of social acceptability piece. In the early days of developing Connect, and I think this probably speaks to some of the other work we've been involved in over the years as well, we were a bit hard on that. We were a bit like, never mind that. Stop focusing on what might feel good. Stop focusing on whether or not you can do it and focus on what works. So kind of maybe in a more explicit way, circling back to your question, we've learned that that's not workable. We've learned that actually you have to build approaches in education, and this is true for parents as well, that are workable for them, that are socially acceptable in context, and they have to work too. But I think the social acceptability question is the first question, is we need to develop something that is possible to deliver in this context. And then next, we need to make sure it's going to make a difference in ways that we care about, that we value. So I think that's been a really useful learning. And maybe there's space for us to say some things that sometimes can start off not seeming feasible, possible, socially acceptable, can become so when you have a somewhat more blazed trail for such things. So there's room in this work if you're willing to be brave. My friend and colleague Nick Hooper talks about the brave jar. How many coins did you get in your brave jar this week? mainly for his kids, but sometimes he uses it with us as well. There's a need for bravery when it comes to trailblazing, I think, because the path ain't clear, But what's interesting, and I guess I'm getting to a point in my career now where I do love innovating. I definitely identify with innovation as a core value. There's something appetitive about scary things for me now in this space. And I think we've done enough things that have been successful enough that I sort of back us. I'd be like, we'll figure it out. We'll be all right. We know what we're on about. I would not have said that when we started developing Connect, or even when we finished developing Connect. I still would have said, God, hope this works. You get to a point where you just know your context well enough to think, we'll figure it out. And if we don't, we'll know, But generally speaking, we managed to do okay. I don't know if that's off the piece that doesn't exist or not, but it's what comes to mind.
I'll be more literary than off the piece. There's a Spanish poet called Mercado who wrote a brilliant poem that includes the phrase I use a lot in training, traveller, there is no path. The path is made by walking. So you forge the path there.
Love it.
So bearing in mind that there's probably people who listening to this podcast who might not be professionals, but they are sharing their house with some younger people. If you could give a parent just one bit of useful advice based around the psychological flexibility, what would it be?
Oh, does it have to be one?
You can have a few if you want.
Okay.
Top three.
Three. Okay. All right. It's interesting, isn't it? Like, you've asked me for advice, and maybe actually this is my first piece of advice, but there's a kind of, I'm trying to flip it so that it doesn't land as advice, is that Steve Hayes probably needs no introduction to anybody who might be listening to this. I've heard him say a few times, advice giving is one of the worst ways to change behavior. So maybe me giving advice in this context is exactly the thing I probably shouldn't be doing. And so I'm going to try and get around that by saying, when it's possible and when the risks are low enough, as a parent, allow kids to experience it for themselves. It's like, you're walking out the door and it's raining and they're like, don't want to put my jacket on. Fine. Like, how many parents get locked into that? Put your jacket on for the fifth time, like, do it or I'm going to do it for you. That kind of like, oh, really? Is it worth this level of suffering? This level of kind of like aversive social interaction? That's cool. Yeah, no worries. I'll put it in my bag. If you change your mind halfway down the road, I'll put it on for you. You get 5 minutes down the road. Mom, can I have my jacket, please? Oh, it's a bit wet, is it? Oh, yeah. Oh, okay. We'll put your jacket on. Yeah, good idea. Like, let them try it, let them track it. Let's discover a skill stuff, right? So that would be one thing. Less advice giving, more direct exposure. Let them figure it out for themselves. But, and then maybe that leads into another useful piece of advice, which is, know that sometimes you can't expose them. Know that sometimes you've got to say, this is the way it's going to go down because it's too risky. You don't let a 4-year-old cross the lights without holding their hand and pressing the light, do you? Do you know what I mean? And pressing the button and waiting for the man to go green, yada, yada, yada. And that's maybe just a particularly stark example, but there are all kinds of fine grades that lead up to completely risk-free, crack on, figure it out for yourself, right? I think there's something as a parent in like, know when it's on your terms because you're the parent. And we see, too much in our work with our particular populations of young people. Too often parents give young people, children, the control that they're not quite ready to have yet because they haven't been on the planet long enough to have figured out how to use that control in a way that keeps them and others safe. So like, when the risk is high, take the reins. You've got the control, not them. You're the adult, not them. And then I think related to that, the third thing, because you did say I could have three, would be know that often when you try to take the reins or do things that are more generally not your common, typical way of doing things, your mind's going to get super mindy with it's all going to go wrong. So let's just admit that and have that in the conversation. Let's know that that's going to happen, but that's just what happens when you yourself step into new spaces and try out new things because you know it's the right thing to do, but it's a bit scary. And when fear shows up, minds get busy. It's just like the right thing to do isn't make that stuff go away. The right thing to do is keep doing the right thing to keep your kids safe and support their development, even if your mind's being mindy. There you go. That's my 3.
Very nice. Very nice indeed. Thank you.
So, Duncan, if people, as I'm sure they have been intrigued by what they've heard from you, we've already said we'll put a link in the show notes to the article, sort of summary article you and your colleagues recently wrote about this kind of approach in educational settings, particularly. Where else might people look to learn more about this kind of stuff?
So Louise Hayes has a wonderful website called DNAV International, and she and Joe Cherokee, who's the other co-developer of DNAV, they are incredibly generous with their resources. So if you go onto DNAV International, there's so many wonderful practical resources for practitioners, for parents, for therapists, for teachers even. So that's a wonderful source. And if you're interested in schools-based practice, doing psychological flexibility, just Google connectcurriculum.org. And it's all free. Like, we've made the entire program completely free. It meets all the statutory requirements in the UK for PSHE curriculums. It's got 36 lessons a year for 7 years, comprehensively developed. I feel like I'm being a salesman, but I'm not, because it's all free. So yeah, check that stuff out. You can subscribe for free and just see what's on there that might be of use to you. Those are some good starters for 10.
Wow.
You're being the world's worst salesman now, aren't you?
Yeah. Awful. That's why we made it free.
Yeah, no, seriously, that's really cool, isn't it? That you've put so much work into this, and there is this evidence-based thing that's just available for people to just pick up and use. I mean, that's awesome.
Thanks, Rich.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Duncan. That's been a really illuminating conversation. We covered a lot of territory. However, we can't let you go straight away, because we have a tradition on this podcast, which is that we invite Ray to answer a random question, which I'll spring on him at a moment's notice. And so you get to join in too. We all ready?
As I'll ever be.
Oh, yeah.
Let's go and ask Ray, shall we?
If you could have a live feed of anywhere or anything in the world, what would you watch?
Oh, man. That's a really good one. There's a beach in the southern island of New Zealand where blue penguins, these like tiny little penguins, who spend all the day out in the sea penguining, but they only ever sleep on the shore, and they all come in at night, and they come in kind of slightly hesitantly, and sometimes they come in like little lines all at once, and you can watch them come in, and it is just, I don't know why, it is just one of the most unconditionally positive things you can watch. Is these penguins that are coming in from the sea, tiny little ones, hopping up in lines, ready to roost for the night. That would be a really feel-good live web feed.
I like that. That's a good answer. If the bar is high. Okay then, Duncan, over to you.
Don't think I can beat that, but I have some very fond memories of being in Thailand for a year on a little island called Koh Tao in the south of Thailand in the Thai Gulf. We had these really rickety old bungalows with hammocks outside. And habitually what I would do is fall asleep in those hammocks. And then by about 3 o'clock in the morning, I'd wake up cold from the Thai Gulf breeze and kind of go into my bungalow. So the first thing that shows up when you ask that question is that view of just watching the sunset going down while sitting in a hammock overlooking the Thai Gulf. But I think what's the phrase in Star Trek where you beam, they beam, I beam my kids there so that my kids could be in the warm water at the sunset, just kind of playing in that really warm Thai Gulf. I'd probably be sipping a cold beer.
Brilliant. Rich, what you got?
See, now I feel ashamed now, because one of the things about this is I get to choose the question, right? I get a bit of time to think about it. So the answer I'm going to give now either says something terrible about me that I just need some sort of help, or that maybe just having time to think about things isn't always the best approach to addressing a problem. So what went on in my head was I wanted to be able to see Donald Trump 24/7. You know, like the cameras in the Big Brother house. I wanted just to be able to have eyes on him the whole time to see what he's like behind closed doors, and is he actually as objectionable as he seems in public? You know, what does he say when there's no cameras on? What's he like then? As unpleasant as I find him, I find him absolutely fascinating. So it's a professional curiosity thing. Although I feel now that I've just approached this completely wrong, and that both of your answers are infinitely superior and would be much better for my mental health in the longer term.
If you were to do like multiple exemplar training where you were trying to get kids picking the odd one out, you, you definitely be the winning answer, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like on Sesame Street, isn't it? One of these things is not like the other. One of these things just isn't the same.
Yeah.
Which one of these older men needs professional help? Okay, well, we on that bombshell, as I like to say, we'll leave it, shall we? And so just remains for me to say thank you very much, Duncan. Thank you very much for coming along and talking to us. It's been an absolute pleasure. So take care, my friend. Look after yourself. And everyone else out there, we will see you again with a new guest next month. Take care. Bye-bye.
See you all.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for inviting me on.